The wind howled across the open plains as the last hues of gold slipped behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows over the dry earth. Thomas Granger, a solitary cowboy known for speaking more to his horse than to people, was finishing up his daily chores near the barn. His hands were rough, calloused from years of work under the brutal sun, and his eyes carried the tired stillness of a man who had learned to live without expecting much. The prairie, with all its silence and struggle, had become his only companion. Since he lost his wife to a fever 5 winters ago, he had no kin nearby, no hired help, and few neighbors who dared ride out this far. Out here, it was just the wind, the sky, and the whisper of coyotes after dark. He had just dumped the last sack of oats into the feed trough when something moved in the corner of his eye, a flicker of motion by the edge of the barn. At first, Thomas thought it was a stray dog, maybe a coyote trying its luck. But when he stepped forward, rifle resting casually across his shoulder, he saw the outline of a child. A boy, small, thin, hunched over near the trough. The child didn't flinch when Thomas approached, nor did he run. He simply sat there, his hands shaking as he dipped them weakly into the water. Thomas paused. The boy was native, no doubt about it, dark hair matted with dust, skin weathered by the sun. His ribs showed through a torn deerskin shirt, and his bare feet were cracked and bleeding. The boy's eyes, wide with exhaustion and mistrust, met Thomas's. Neither of them said a word. The cowboy's instinct, honed by years of conflict and caution on the edge of Apache territory, told him to be careful. This could be a trick, maybe a trap, maybe the boy was bait. But his heart, worn and buried as it was, whispered something else. No child that skinny and starved was pretending. Thomas knelt slowly and reached into his coat. The boy stiffened. But instead of a weapon, the cowboy pulled out half a loaf of bread. Rough, dry, but enough. He held it out without saying a word. The boy hesitated only a second before snatching it with both hands and stuffing it into his mouth so quickly he nearly choked. Thomas didn't stop him. He just watched, the wind tugging at his hat, the sky above dimming to velvet blue. After the bread was gone, Thomas gestured toward the cabin. "Come on, then," he muttered, not knowing if the boy understood. "Ain't no sense starving to death out here." The child didn't reply but followed, limping slightly as he walked. Thomas opened the creaky door and stepped aside too. "Let him in." The boy paused, uncertain, as though unsure if this was a trap too. But hunger overrode fear, and he stepped inside. The warmth of the fireplace hit him first, then the smell of stew, faint but real. Thomas handed him a wool blanket and pointed to the chair near the hearth. The boy sank into it like a falling stone, curling his arms around himself. He still hadn't spoken. Thomas ladled a bit of the rabbit stew into a tin bowl and handed it over. The boy looked at him, hesitated, then took it and ate slowly this time. Each bite seemed to thaw the ice inside him. Still, no words. Just heavy eyes and slow breathing. After he finished, he wrapped himself tighter in the blanket and drifted off to sleep. Thomas sat back in his rocker and stared into the flames. The boy was probably lost, maybe abandoned, maybe worse. Whatever his story was, Thomas didn't press. He simply kept the fire fed, listening to the wind outside, rifle propped nearby out of habit more than threat. In his heart, though, a storm was starting to build. This wasn't just a hungry child, it was something more. He could feel it in his bones. The kind of feeling you get before lightning strikes. Outside, the prairie was quiet. But far beyond the hills, something was coming. Thomas didn't sleep that night. Not really. He sat in his chair beside the fire, the boy curled beneath a blanket not 10 feet away. Outside, the wind whispered low through the cracks in the wooden walls, and the ranch creaked as the cold deepened. The old cowboy's eyes never left the rifle resting against the table, nor the window that looked out onto the dark prairie. Years of living near Apache land had taught him something city men never learned. Every act of kindness out here carried weight. Every small decision echoed. He wasn't scared. Not exactly. But something gnawed at his gut, an unease that grew with each hour that passed. The boy hadn't spoken. Not a name, not a tribe, not even a sound beyond his soft breathing. He had simply eaten, curled up, and slept like he hadn't closed his eyes in days. That alone told Thomas something had gone terribly wrong. No family left, no camp nearby, no sign of where he'd come from, and most of all, no one looking for him. Yet Thomas leaned forward and threw another log on the fire. The flames jumped, casting flickering light across the child's small face. There were scratches on his arms, bruises on his ankle, old injuries, not fresh, but signs of hardship. He couldn't have been more than 7, maybe 8 years old, but his eyes had the hollowness of someone who'd seen too much. Whatever this child had endured, it had left its mark. The cowboy rubbed his face, feeling the weight of his years. He'd lived in this cabin alone for over a decade. Since the war, since the fever took his wife, since the neighbors stopped visiting and the letters from back east stopped coming, he'd seen peace treaties signed and broken, lands taken, families pushed west, others left behind. Through it all, Thomas had kept to himself, not out of hatred, but out of weariness. The land didn't care what side you were on. It just demanded your strength. But now, something had shifted. One simple act, bread shared with a starving child, might turn the wheel of fate again. Just before dawn, the fire burned low. The boy stirred in his sleep, murmured something in Apache, and rolled over. Thomas stood slowly, stepped to the window, and peered into the soft blue haze of early morning. At first, it looked like mist hanging at the edge of the prairie. But then the sound came faint, steady. Rhythmic.hoofbeats. Not one or two, dozens, then more. Thomas squinted, his hand already moving to the rifle. Across the ridge, dark shapes emerged, one after another, until the horizon shimmered with motion. Riders' lines of them, silent and steady. Paint glinting off bare chests. Spears tipped with metal and bone. The Apache. 200 at least, maybe more. Mounted and moving with purpose, but not in a rush. They weren't charging, they weren't shouting. They were surrounding. Thomas opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch. The morning air hit him like a cold slap, but he stood tall. The boy, now awake, stood beside him a moment later, silent as ever. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, his face was calm, too calm for a child. The warriors spread in a wide arc around the ranch, forming a full circle at a distance of 50 yards. They said nothing, did nothing, just sat their horses, waiting. Some held spears, others had bows, a few had rifles. They didn't move forward, didn't make demands. They simply watched. Thomas stood motionless, the boy still beside him. Every instinct in him screamed caution, but the child showed no fear, only stillness. He looked up at Thomas, then back at the gathering warriors, and stepped forward off the porch. The cowboy's breath caught in his throat. What would happen next was uncertain, but Thomas knew, deep down, that this moment had been coming since he handed that piece of bread to a starving child the night before. It had been a small act, a human act. But out here, on the edge of two worlds, small acts echoed louder than bullets. And now, the whole prairie had come to listen. For a long time, nothing moved. The warriors stayed motionless on their horses, their gazes fixed on the cabin, while the cold wind stirred the grass around them. Thomas Granger stood barefoot on the porch, the wood chilled under his soul's heart, steady but alert. His rifle hung loosely by his side, not raised, not pointed, but close enough. He wasn't stupid. He didn't know if they had come to thank him or kill him. And out here, the line between the two could shift like dust in the wind. Beside him, the child stepped down from the porch, barefoot and calm, his thin legs wobbling, slightly from exhaustion. He stood tall for someone so small, wrapped in the wool blanket Thomas had given him the night before. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, and to Thomas's surprise, he walked toward the warriors with quiet purpose. The circle of Apache riders opened slightly, just enough to let one figure through. A tall man rode forward, proud, still, and wearing a long coat made of elk hide, its surface decorated with beads and feathers that told stories of blood, honor, and survival. His face was painted in muted tones of red and white, and his eyes, dark and deep as night rivers, bore into Thomas with unsettling calm. This was no ordinary warrior. This was the chief. The child stopped walking and stood in front of the horse. He said something in Apache, voice soft but clear. The chief dismounted slowly, his gaze never leaving the boy. He placed one large, calloused hand on the child's head and spoke back just a few words, but they carried weight. Then the chief looked up and fixed his eyes on Thomas. The cowboy didn't move. He wasn't about to run or apologize. He had done what any man should have done. A starving child didn't need a history lesson. He needed bread. The chief walked forward alone. No weapons, no gestures, just the quiet strength of a man who had buried sons, fought battles, and lived long, enough to understand when the wind was about to change. When he reached the porch, he stopped at the bottom step, looked up at Thomas, and spoke. "He gave food to my grandson," he said in slow, accented English. His voice was low, deep, like distant thunder. No questions, no fear. Thomas nodded once. "Didn't see a reason to ask his blood before I gave him bread." The chief studied him. Many would have turned him away. Many already did. He ran through 2 nights, alone, hungry, chased. Thomas frowned. "Chased?" The chief nodded. "By men in blue coats, soldiers. They burned our winter camp, took the women, shot the horses. He escaped, barefoot, found you." A lump rose in Thomas's throat, but he kept his expression still. So this boy had seen the kind of horror no child should. No wonder he hadn't spoken. He was running from death. The chief reached into a leather pouch and pulled out a single white eagle feather. He extended it toward Thomas. "This," he said, "is not given lightly. It means you are not our enemy." Thomas didn't hesitate. He stepped down and took the feather with a nod. The child beside the chief looked up at him not with fear, but with something close to trust. The warriors around the ranch shifted subtly, the tension in the circle easing like ice melting under spring sun. Some lowered their weapons. Others murmured quietly among themselves. The chief raised one hand, and silence fell again. "You gave bread," he said, but you gave more than that. You gave safety. You gave dignity. That is remembered. Thomas said nothing. He wasn't used to praise. He wasn't used to being seen. The chief nodded once more, then turned and walked back toward his horse. The boy followed him a few steps, then stopped, looking back at Thomas with uncertain eyes. He didn't want to leave. Thomas called out softly, "He's welcome to stay, if he wants." The chief looked back. For the first time, he smiled, a small, sad smile. "We will speak of it." And then, as the sun rose behind them, casting gold over the plains, the 200 warriors turned their horses and rode off slowly into the morning. Only the child remained behind. When the dust settled and the thunder of hooves faded into the horizon, the prairie fell back into its familiar stillness. But something fundamental had changed. The silence that followed wasn't lonely anymore. It was watchful, thoughtful, sacred. Thomas stood quietly on the porch, feathers still in hand, the morning sun warming his skin as the boy turned round and faced him again. The child didn't speak, but his eyes were wide and uncertain, as if unsure what came next. He had just watched his entire world ride away in a long procession of warriors and dust. Now, all that remained was a quiet ranch, a fireplace, and a man he barely knew. The boy seemed to be asking a question without words. "Am I allowed to stay?" Thomas knelt down slowly, his joints creaking from years of hard living. "You got somewhere to go, kid?" he asked gently. The boy shook his head once. "Then I reckon you're with me for now." Still no words, but the boy's shoulders relaxed, ever so slightly. It wasn't quite trust yet, but it was something. Back inside the cabin, Thomas made breakfast. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could fry eggs and stir beans well enough. The boy watched silently from the corner, blankets still wrapped tight around him like armor. He didn't seem scared, just guarded, cautious, like someone who'd learned that the world didn't always give second chances. As they ate in silence, Thomas studied the boy from across the table. There was intelligence behind those eyes, awareness, the kind of quiet strength that reminded him more of warriors than of children. He finally asked, "What's your name, son?" The boy looked at him, then looked away. "No name, or just don't want to tell me." The child hesitated. Then, after a long pause, he murmured something in Apache. The words were soft, strange, on Thomas's ears, but filled with emotion. He tried to repeat them, fumbling the syllables. The boy gave the faintest smile. "Just a flicker." "Well, I'll keep trying till I get it right," Thomas said with a grunt. "But kid LL have to do for now." Over the next few days, the two of them settled into a rhythm. The boy, still mostly silent, followed Thomas around the ranch. He watched as Thomas fed the horses, chopped wood, mended the fence, and patched the holes in the roof. He never got in the way, but he always watched. And sometimes, if Thomas handed him a tool or nodded toward a task, the boy would join in. They didn't speak much. But then again, out on the frontier, words weren't always the currency of understanding. Sometimes, silence said more. At night, Thomas would sit by the fire, nursing coffee or a shot of whiskey, while the boy lay near the hearth under thick blankets. Sometimes he'd speak, telling old stories about his youth, about the war, about a woman he once loved and lost. He wasn't sure the boy understood all of it, but he listened, always listened. One evening, as a cold wind blew outside and the fire popped and cracked, the boy finally spoke. "My name," he said softly, "is Tahoma." Thomas turned, surprised not by the sound of the voice, but by the clarity in it. "Tahoma," he repeated. "That's a strong name." The boy nodded. "It means giver of water." Thomas chuckled dryly. "Well, I reckon giver of bread might fit too." Tahoma didn't smile, but he seemed pleased. A connection had been made. Not a bond of blood, not even a full bond of trust, but a beginning. Later that night, Thomas stepped out onto the porch. He looked out across the empty plains, the moonlight casting long silver shadows across the grass. Somewhere out there, 200 warriors had returned to their lands. Somewhere out there, people were still running, still starving, still hunted. But here, in this little pocket of the frontier, something new had taken root. A boy without a home, a man without a purpose, and a fragile thread of hope pulling them together. And for the first time in years, Thomas Granger didn't feel quite so alone. Nearly a week passed since the warriors rode off and left Tahoma behind, but the weight of that morning still lingered like a scent in the air. Life on the ranch had settled into something like rhythm, quiet, simple, deliberate, the kind of life Thomas Granger had always preferred. But now, with the boy under his roof, it felt fuller, less hollow. Like the silence between wind gusts wasn't just emptiness anymore, it was breathing room. Tahoma rarely spoke, but he had grown more comfortable. He followed Thomas into the barn every morning, helped brush down the horses, hauled buckets of water from the well, and fed the chickens without being asked. When Thomas taught him how to saddle a horse, the boy learned with startling speed. When he handed him a hammer and motioned to a crooked fence post, the boy knew exactly what to do. It was clear this child came from strong hands and smart people. It made Thomas wonder what kind of warriors had raised him before soldiers tore that world apart. One afternoon, they were tending to a broken wagon wheel behind the barn when Tahoma paused and lifted his head. He sniffed the air, then turned toward the horizon, his expression sharpening. "What is it?" Thomas asked. Wiping grease from his fingers, Tahoma pointed eastward toward the low hills. At first, Thomas saw nothing. Then a dark blur began to rise on the far horizon. Not clouds, not dust from grazing herds. Smoke, a thick pillar curling steadily upward into the blue sky. Thomas stood. "That's not natural." Tahoma nodded, jaw tight. The boy stepped toward the house, but Thomas stopped him gently. "No need to panic. Could be a rancher burning brush, or some fool setting fire to old stumps." But even as he said it, he knew better. That smoke was too black, too heavy. That was the kind of smoke that came from buildings. From wood soaked in old oil. From flesh, sometimes, by evening, the smoke had grown darker, thicker. It drifted into the sky like a warning, and Tahoma wouldn't stop watching it. His food sat untouched on the table. Thomas tried to distract him with stories about prairie storms and stubborn cattle, but the boy wasn't listening. Later that night, as the sky went deep navy and the fire cracked inside the cabin, Tahoma finally spoke. "They came back," he whispered. "The soldiers." Thomas turned from the window. "You think that's your people's camp?" Tahoma nodded once. Thomas looked back at the smoke, which was now a faint gray smudge against the stars. "You sure?" The boy didn't answer, but his eyes glistened with something raw and unmistakable grief, mixed with rage. Thomas sat down across from him. "Look, kid, Tahoma, you're safe here. Whatever's out there, I promise, it ain't getting through this door without a fight." Tahoma looked up. "You don't understand. Try me." The boy swallowed hard. "They're not just soldiers. They hunt, for sport. They kill because they can. That's what they did to my brother, my mother." Thomas felt the weight of those words hit like a stone. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. He'd heard stories like this during the war. Villages burned for no reason, of children killed while their mothers screamed, of the kind of cruelty only men with power and no purpose could carry out. But hearing it from the lips of a child made it unbearable. Thomas stood, walked to the corner, and picked up the feather the Apache chief had given him. He looked at it, then at the boy. "If they're back," he said slowly, "they might come." Here next Tahoma met his eyes. "Will you hide me again?" Thomas didn't blink. "No." The boy tensed, but Thomas kept talking. "I won't hide you. I'll stand with you, and I'll fight if I have to. You're not alone anymore." For the first time, Tahoma's face changed. He blinked fast, as if something behind his eyes had cracked open, letting light in. He didn't speak again that night. But when Thomas banked the fire and turned in, he found the boy curled up beside the hearth, holding the feather close to his chest. And outside, the wind carried the smell of burning over the hills. Tomorrow might bring trouble. But tonight, they had each other and a decision to make. The next morning broke cold and silent. Mist clung low to the grass, and the smoke from the eastern horizon had spread like a dark wing across the sky. Thomas Granger stepped outside with a rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the hills. Something in the air felt wrong, tense, off balance. Even the birds had gone quiet. Tahoma was already outside, crouched by the fence with his small hands pressed against the earth. He was listening not with ears, but with instinct. He looked up at Thomas and spoke a word in Apache that Thomas didn't know, but he understood its meaning. "They're close." Thomas nodded grimly. "How many?" Tahoma held up 3 fingers, then 5 more. 8. Thomas cursed under his breath. 8. Men? Soldiers, maybe, raiders, or worse, scouts, sent ahead of something larger. Back in the house, Thomas packed ammunition and checked the rifle again. It was old but reliable. He handed Tahoma a small revolver and loaded for no end, taught him where to sit, when to run, what to do if things went wrong. The boy listened carefully, absorbing every word like scripture. His face was calm, but his eyes had seen war before. He didn't flinch. Hours passed with no sign. The smoke thickened. Then, just before dusk, the riders came. They crested the eastern hill like ghosts out of a nightmare at figures on horseback, dressed in dirty uniforms and dust-covered hats. Not military standard, but close. Their rifles gleamed in the fading light, and one carried a torch. Another wore a necklace of Apache ears. Freshly taken. Thomas and Tahoma stood silently near the barn as the riders approached. Thomas didn't raise his weapon, not yet. The lead rider, a scar-faced man with dead eyes, stopped a few yards from the gate. "Nice spread," he said, voice gravelly. "Didn't figure anyone lived out here still." Thomas didn't move. "Just me and the boy." The man's eyes slid over to Tahoma. "That your son closing up?" The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that turned stomachs. "Funny, he looks Apache to me." Thomas didn't answer. Scarface dismounted slowly, motioning to the others to stay back. "We're just passing through. Heard some of the tribes been raiding nearby. Thought maybe you seen anything." Thomas met his gaze. "Smoke that way," he said, pointing east. "Big camp. But you already knew that." Scarface's grin widened. "Yeah, we helped start it. That was all." Thomas needed to hear. His hand tightened on the rifle, and for a moment, the air between them turned to iron. "You're harboring one of theirs," the man said, stepping closer. "You know what that makes you?" "I know exactly what it makes me," Thomas said, flatly. "It makes me the only thing standing between him and the kind of men who murder children." The rider's face twisted with mock pity. "That's real noble, old man. But noble don't survive long out here." Behind him, one of the others raised a rifle. Thomas fired first. The shot cracked the evening wide open. The rider with the torch fell backward off his horse, and chaos exploded in every direction. Tahoma darted behind the barn as Thomas dropped into a crouch and fired again, hitting the man with a necklace of ears square in the chest. Bullets whizzed past the porch. Horses screamed. Splinters flew from the gatepost. Then came a sound neither Thomas nor the riders expected: the long, high-pitched cry of a war horn. From the southern ridge, dozens of figures appeared, painted warriors on horseback, feathered lances raised, eyes burning with fury. The 200 Apache warriors had returned. Scarface turned in his saddle, just in time to see them descend. Thomas lowered his rifle and stepped back as the tide of justice swept in like a wave. He didn't need to fight anymore. Not now. The boy's people had come not for revenge, but for protection. Tahoma stood at his side, his face unreadable, but his eyes were alive. "See," Thomas said quietly, "you weren't alone after all." And together, they watched the riders fall. The dust had barely settled when silence fell again over the land, this time heavier and more sacred than before. The sun hovered low on the horizon, throwing long shadows across the ranch. 8 riders lay dead in the dirt, no more than raiders. Perhaps scouts for something worse, but they wouldn't ride again. Thomas Granger stood with his rifle at his side, not as a victor, but as a man trying to breathe after holding it in for far too long. His eyes didn't leave the bodies. He'd fired to protect a child. He'd killed men to stop a murder. Still, it weighed on him. Beside him, Tahoma looked up, calm, steady, almost solemn. His small hand gripped Thomas's coat gently. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Then came the sound of soft hoofbeats, different than before. Not fast, not thunderous, but deliberate and strong. A figure approached through the lingering smoke and brush. A tall man, older, his gray-black braids tied behind him. His horse was painted, streaked in white clay and ochre. This was no ordinary warrior. He was a chief. The warriors parted without a word, letting him through. Thomas stepped off the porch and met the man halfway. "You are the one who sheltered the boy?" the chief asked, his English accented but clear. "I gave him bread. Warmth," Thomas said simply. "He was cold, starving." The chief looked over at Tahoma, then back at the fallen raiders. "And for that, you killed to protect him." I didn't hesitate. A long silence passed between them. Then the chief dismounted, removing his gloves and holding them in one hand. "You do not know who that boy is?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "He's a child." "That's enough." The chief's lips twitched, not quite a smile but something like approval. "That boy is the son of Nahawi, a warrior who died defending our people in the Bitter River siege. His family believed he had perished, but the spirits must have sent him to you." Thomas blinked, glancing at Tahoma, who still stood barefoot near the barn, watching with solemn eyes. "You mean, he's the son of someone important?" "He is the blood of a line we thought lost," the chief said, "and your kindness has preserved that legacy. You did not know his name. You had nothing to gain, yet you gave." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do it for reward." "I know," the chief said. "That is why the spirits favor you." Behind them, the Apache warriors began to chant, lowly, not a song of war, but of mourning. A few had started to gather the bodies of the dead raiders. There would be no desecration, no further vengeance. The enemy had met justice. The matter was closed. Tahoma slowly walked up and stood between the two men. One of the older women who had arrived with the warriors stepped forward and knelt before him. Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered a prayer in Apache. Then, reaching into her satchel, she pulled out a beaded pendenta, family mark. When she held it up, Tahoma stared at it, confused at first. Then something in him seemed to break open. His eyes flooded with tears as he whispered Nokomis. The woman nodded. "Yes, I am your grandmother." Thomas swallowed hard, watching the boy press into her arms. There was something deeply right about it, something beyond understanding. The chief turned back to Thomas. "Tonight, we camp here. At dawn, we will return to our lands. The boy will come with us, if that is what he wishes." Thomas looked over at Tahoma. The boy caught his gaze, and, after a long pause, gave a single small nod. A mix of sadness and peace settled in Thomas's chest. "Then it's the right thing. But he is not the only one, with no people," the chief said. "If you would come with us, there would be room for you among our fires." Thomas hesitated. He had spent years alone, years thinking the world had nothing left for him. Yet this moment, this boy had opened something inside him he hadn't felt since his wife died. He looked up at the sky, then back at the chief. "I'll think about it." The chief nodded. "We ride at sunrise." And as night fell across the prairie, Fires were lit not of war, but of healing. For the first time in many years, Thomas Granger felt something stir inside his chest. Hope. The prairie was hushed in the still hours before dawn. A thin veil of mist clung to the grass, and a soft breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The Apache warriors had made camp just beyond the barn, their fires now reduced to glowing embers. Horses stood quietly tethered nearby, their silhouettes blending into the rolling landscape. Thomas Granger sat alone on the porch, elbows resting on his knees, a coffee tin cooling in his calloused hands. He hadn't slept, not because of fear he hadn't felt afraid in days, but because something inside him was shifting. The loneliness that had once clung to him like a second skin was loosening its grip. Behind him, the old screen door creaked open. Tahoma stepped outside, wrapped in a wool blanket. His hair was neatly braided now, his face freshly washed. But his eyes, quiet and searching, were the same. He walked over and sat beside Thomas without a word, their shoulders almost touching. "You sleep okay?" Thomas asked softly. Tahoma nodded, then looked out toward the horizon, where the first thread of light was beginning to stretch across the sky. "My grandmother says we leave after sunrise." Thomas gave a small grunt. "Makes sense, it's a long way home." There was silence again, but not the heavy kind they once knew. This silence was peaceful, something like understanding. "Don't remember much about my father," Tahoma said suddenly, "but my grandmother says he was brave, kind." Thomas glanced at him. "I believe her." Tahoma hesitated, then turned to face him. "You're kind too, I think. The spirits sent me to you." Thomas felt a knot rise in his throat, one he wasn't used to. He cleared it roughly. "Maybe they did, or maybe it was just luck." "No," Tahoma said firmly. "It wasn't luck." Thomas couldn't argue with that. In all his years alone, no one had come to his door. Not until a starving boy stumbled through the cold and into his life. As the sun crested the horizon, golden light poured over the plains. The camp began to stir. Warriors moved quietly, efficiently packing, saddling, preparing to ride. The chief stood near the lead horse, his tall frame silhouetted against the dawn. Thomas stood and offered his hand. Tahoma took it. Together, they stepped down into the yard. The boy's grandmother met them halfway. She smiled gently at Thomas, her weathered face soft with gratitude. "You gave him bread and life," she said. "That cannot be repaid." Thomas shook his head. "He gave me something too." The chief approached, his eyes steady. "We would have you ride with us, Thomas Granger. There is space beside our fire. A man like you, one who gives without asking, has a place among us." Thomas looked from the chief to Tahoma, then back at the cabin. It stood quiet and alone, as it had for years. Every board in that house held a memory of solitude, but now it felt hollow, empty. He turned back to the boy. "What do you think, kid? Should I come?" Tahoma didn't answer with words. He just smiled and nodded, a shy hope flickering in his eyes. That was enough. By mid-morning, the line of riders stretched out across the plain like a ribbon of life. Thomas rode near the front, his old mare holding pace beside the chief's painted horse. Tahoma sat proudly just behind his grandmother, holding the reins with growing confidence. The land they rode into was open and wild, but it no longer felt lonely. As they disappeared over the far hill, the ranch behind them grew smaller, finally swallowed by the horizon. Thomas didn't look back. Somewhere out ahead, fires would be lit, songs would be sung, and a man who thought he had nothing left would sit among people who truly saw him for the first time in years. And in the eyes of a once starving child, he had found purpose again. A new life had begun at the edge of that prairie, one born not from blood, but from bread, and the simple, stubborn kindness of a man who opened his door.